The Missouri River was swollen with the late winter thaw, its icy waters churning with a dangerous current that made crossing a gamble even for the most skilled frontiersman. John Hawk Hensley, a drifter of no small renown among the scattered settlements along the river, rode his worn horse along the narrow ridge that overlooked the tumultuous water. Hawk was a man molded by the wilderness, lean, calloused, and taciturn, with eyes the color of cold steel and hands that could skin a deer, mend a gun, or navigate the treacherous mountain passes without thought. By 29, he had wandered farther into the Rockies than most men would dare to dream, yet the hunger for both fortune and freedom still gnawed at him. He carried little besides a flintlock rifle, a powder horn, a battered blanket roll, and a leather satchel stuffed with a few hardtacks and salted meat. Every step along the snow-crusted ridge reminded him of how fragile a man's life could be on the frontier. The wind cut through his coat, tugging at his hood, carrying with it the sharp scent of pine and the faint tang of river water. Even now he remained alert, listening for the low growl of wolves, the snapping of branches under deer hooves, or the distant roar of a bear moving through the timber. Survival demanded constant attention. The wilderness owed nothing to the solitary man who sought to make a living from its harsh generosity. By mid-morning, Hawk descended toward a small trading post nestled at the base of a rugged mountain range. The building was nothing more than rough-hewn logs with a sod roof, smoke curling lazily from a central chimney. Wagons and pack animals were tethered outside, and a handful of settlers and trappers milled about, their faces lined with frostbite, toil, and the quiet resignation of men who had learned to live by the mercy of both nature and the occasional generosity of distant governments. Hawk tied his horse to a hitching post and approached, eyes scanning for familiar faces. None appeared, though a grizzled trapper with a long beard and a pipe tucked into his mouth gave a nod of acknowledgment. Hawk's entrance did not go unnoticed. A group of men paused their conversation about beaver pelts and river roots, exchanging wary glances. Travelers were common, but a drifter like Hawk, someone who carried no permanent claim, no family, and no allegiance, was a figure who could invite suspicion or curiosity in equal measure. He stepped inside the trading post, his boots leaving dark prints on the worn wooden floor, and approached the counter where a squat man with red cheeks and a mop of unruly hair weighed a small pile of coins. "I'm looking for work," Hawk said, voice low and steady. "Or information, either will do." The trader, a man named Samuel Dorr, studied him for a moment, then grunted. "You've come far, stranger. Most men turn back before the mountains grow steep like that. There's talk of a mine to the Pliant. East gold and silver, some say, but it's cursed. Nobody who's gone near it in the last 5 years has returned whole." Hawk's brow furrowed. "Cursed?" Dorr shrugged. "Call it superstition, call it what you will. Some say it's the mountain spirits, others claim the last miners left in a hurry after men disappeared and tools went missing. No one's brave enough to check. Settlers avoid it, hunters steer clear, and even the local Blackfeet have their warnings." Hawk leaned against the counter, his mind already turning over the implications. The mountain men he had read about in the journals, the likes of Jedediah Smith and Kit Carson, had built reputations not by staying safe, but by testing the edges of danger. Superstition had never stopped them, and fortune rarely favored the timid. He could almost taste the faint tang of silver and gold beneath the earth, buried for decades, hidden behind rumors that made lesser men tremble. "Names?" Hawk asked, curiosity, mixing with a pragmatic caution. "Any names of men who went missing?" Dorr shook his head. "Too many. A half-dozen miners, a couple of trappers, maybe even a man who claimed to be a prospector from Street Lewis. The mountain swallows them whole, it seems. Or maybe they get lost in greed, killing each other over veins that weren't worth the risk." Hawk's gaze wandered toward the window, where the peaks of the Rockies rose, jagged and snow-laden against the pale winter sun. The river below snaked its way past the foothills, carrying both the promise of life and the hint of peril. He could see trails where men had passed before paths that vanished into the high timber and the scree slopes above. It was beautiful in a way that threatened both reverence and fear. He stepped back from the counter. "I'll need provisions and maybe some maps, if you've any. Not that I expect to follow the usual routes." Dorr hesitated. Maps won't do you much good. The terrain changes with every season. Rivers flood, snows shift, and trails disappear under fallen trees. Only a man with a strong mind and stronger legs has a chance out there. Hawk only smiled faintly. He was acutely aware of his own destitution. Coins were few, and the need for success immediate. Survival in the Rockies had taught him patience, resilience, and the value of wit over brute strength. Every mountain man before him, Smith, Carson, Larpenteur, had relied not on luck alone, but on an understanding of the land and a readiness to take calculated risks. That evening, Hawk sat outside the trading post beside a small fire. The wind cut through his coat and the smoke stung his eyes, but he welcomed it. He thought of the mine, the cursed stories, and the chance to carve a name for himself in a land where legends were born from acts of courage and folly alike. The other men inside the post drank whiskey and laughed at card games, unaware of the solitary figure who watched the fire flicker against the snowy landscape, already planning his path into the unknown. Night settled over the Rockies, vast and unforgiving. Hawk knew that the mountain held secrets few men would dare to uncover. The drifter's heart beat steadily, equal parts caution and anticipation. Somewhere beyond the trees, in the shadow of jagged peaks, the cursed mine waited silent, hidden, and promising the kind of fortune that could elevate a man from obscurity to legend. Hawk tightened his blanket around his shoulders, eyes fixed on the distant ridges, and made a silent vow. He would find that mine, and he would return. The mountain whispered warnings in the wind, but the drifter had learned to listen to the land itself, rather than the fearful voices of men. Fortune, after all, favored those who dared step into the unknown. And John Hawk Hensley, the solitary man with nothing to lose and everything to gain, was about to do just that. The first light of dawn revealed the Rockies in all their austere grandeur. Jagged peaks dusted with snow, ridges that seemed to rise to the clouds, and deep valleys where shadows lingered long after the sun had passed. John Hawk Hensley strapped his rifle across his back, tightened the cinch on his horse, and prepared to leave the safety of the trading post. The wind was sharp, biting at exposed skin, carrying with it the scent of pine and the faint tang of melted snow. Each step toward the high country reminded him that the frontier had no mercy for the unprepared. The trail ahead was little more than a faint impression of hooves and booted feet pressed into frozen earth, winding through dense timber and over frozen streams. Hawk had spent enough winters in the Rockies to know the hazards: hidden crevasses under thin snow, sudden rock slides, and rivers that could sweep a man and his horse away without warning. Yet the call of the rumored mine, the lure of both wealth and reputation, propelled him forward. A man could survive days in the wilderness, even weeks, if he respected its patterns and trusted his own judgment. By mid-morning, Hawk came upon the first test of the trail. A deep ravine cut through the forest, its banks steep and slippery with ice. Beneath it, water gushed with a roar, swollen from the winter thaw. Most men would have sought another path, but Hawk knew how to improvise. He gathered fallen branches, large rocks, and snow-laden logs to fashion a makeshift bridge, testing each piece with his weight before trusting it fully. One misstep here could mean a broken leg or worse. As he crossed, he felt the familiar adrenaline that came from navigating danger, a sensation he had learned to cherish. It reminded him that every choice in the wilderness carried consequence. Every footfall, every decision was a measure of skill, patience, and courage. By the time he reached solid ground on the far side, his heart had slowed, but his mind was sharper than ever. Hawk pressed on, following the trail, deeper into the mountains. The forest thickened, the trees rising like sentinels along the narrow path. The sound of birds was scarce, save for the occasional woodpecker and the distant caw of a raven. Tracks in the snow hinted at wildlife, deer, elk, and the occasional wolf, moving silently through the underbrush. Hawk made a mental note of each sign. Survival demanded constant awareness, a meticulous reading of the land, and the ability to interpret the stories told by tracks, scat, and bent branches. He stopped at a small clearing near a stream to make a brief camp and catch his breath. The creek was partially frozen, but Hawk knew how to break the ice safely and gather water. He stripped the bark from a nearby pine, shaving thin strips to use as tinder, and soon a small fire sputtered to life. The smell of smoke mingled with the crisp mountain air, a small comfort in the immense wilderness. He roasted a few slices of salted venison over the flames, chewing slowly, savoring both the meal and the moment of reprieve. While he ate, Hawk's thoughts returned to the mine. The trading post had spoken of it in hushed tones, calling it cursed, haunted, or simply too dangerous for men to attempt. But Hawk was not most men. He knew the dangers that lurked in the Rockies, and he knew the value of caution balanced with daring. In his mind, superstition was merely the language of fear. It did not deter him. It informed him. Every ghost story, every warning was a clue, a piece of the puzzle he intended to solve. By late afternoon, the forest began to give way to rocky slopes, and the temperature dropped sharply. Snow clung to the ridges in thick drifts, and the wind cut through layers of clothing, biting at fingers and cheeks. Hawk secured his blanket roll and tightened his gloves, scanning the terrain ahead. The mine was said to lie beyond these slopes, hidden in a valley that few men had ever reached. It would require navigation across steep inclines, loose scree, and potentially treacherous ice. Every step upward was a test of endurance. The climb began slowly, each footfall deliberate. Hawk relied on handholds, tested the stability of rocks before trusting them with his weight, and occasionally dismounted to lead his horse up particularly steep sections. By nightfall, he had made significant progress, but was far from the valley that concealed the mine. He found a small overhang beneath a rocky ledge to spend the night. The cold was bitter, and snow fell lightly, dusting his blanket roll and forming thin layers on the rocks above. Yet the fire he managed to coax from wet pine shavings provided warmth, and the steady crackle of flames was a companion in the otherwise silent expanse. As he lay beside the fire, Hawk's mind wandered to the lives of other mountain men he had read about in journals and memoirs. Jedediah Smith had crossed deserts and rivers that seemed impassable. Kit Carson had braved hostile tribes and blizzards. James Beckwourth had negotiated both survival and diplomacy among the Crow. These men had all faced the unknown, relying on skill, courage, and the wisdom of the land. Hawk reminded himself that he was no different. Though each mountain man carved his own path, the principles of endurance and resourcefulness were constant. The wind picked up during the night, howling through the pines like a restless spirit. Hawk lay awake for hours, listening to the sounds of the wilderness, the snap of a branch under a distant animal, the rush of water in unseen streams, and the occasional rumble of rocks loosening and tumbling down a slope. Sleep came fitfully, the drifter always alert, attuned to the subtle warnings of the land. When dawn broke, pale and gray, he rose with practiced efficiency, packed his camp, and resumed the climb. By midday, Hawk reached a ridge that overlooked the valley, where the mine was rumored to lie. The view was both breathtaking and forbidding. The valley below was cloaked in snow, dotted with the dark shapes of pines and the skeletal remains of old mining structures that had succumbed to time and the elements. He paused to rest, taking in the expanse, and for the first time he allowed a flicker of anticipation to mix with his caution. The wilderness had tested him already, yet he was ready for the challenges that lay ahead. Each step, each risk, had prepared him for this moment, to confront the unknown, to seek the mine, and to claim whatever fortune and legend awaited in the mountains. Hawk adjusted the strap of his rifle, patted his horse, and descended into the valley, moving quietly, deliberately, aware that the true trial had only just begun. The drifter had entered the wilderness alone, but the land was alive, watching, testing him at every turn. And John Hawk Hensley, hardened by years of wandering and survival, welcomed the challenge with a steady heart and unwavering resolve. The valley opened before John Hawk Hensley like a secret long held by the Rockies. Snow lay thick over jagged rocks, and the skeletal remains of an old mining camp peeked through pines like the relics of a long-forgotten struggle. Rusted tools, the remnants of wagons, and the charred timbers of a cabin suggested a past abruptly abandoned. Even from a distance, the place exuded an uneasy aura, the kind of place that whispered of greed, danger, and vanished men. The locals' warnings, cursed, haunted, doomed, had not prepared him for the tangible weight of the abandoned camp. Hawk dismounted and moved cautiously, scanning the snow for footprints or tracks of recent passage. The valley was largely silent, except for the occasional sigh of wind across exposed rock and the distant murmur of a stream partially hidden beneath ice. There were signs of life, subtle but unmistakable: scattered deer tracks, a few prints of foxes or coyotes, and evidence that the wildlife had adapted to the encroachment of men and miners alike. Still, Hawk felt the valley. Watch him, the echoes of past misfortune lingering in the quiet. The mine itself was a jagged cut into the mountainside, barely discernible behind a tangle of evergreens and broken boulders. Its entrance yawned like a dark mouth, partially collapsed in places, with timber supports blackened and splintered. Hawk approached slowly, rifle ready, his eyes scanning for loose rocks or treacherous footing. Every miner's journal he had read spoke of hazards both natural and human-made: sudden tunnel collapses, the treachery of greed, the quiet despair that drove men to madness. Here, the stories seemed to breathe in the air itself. He crouched beside the mine entrance, brushing snow from a rusted pickaxe handle, half buried in ice. Faded markings on the wood suggested the initials of men who had worked here decades earlier. Hawk imagined them, desperate, weary, their hands cracked and bleeding from hard labor, eyes filled with dreams of silver and gold. But something had gone wrong, perhaps. A cave-in, a dispute, or the unforgiving elements, and the valley had claimed them. Even as he respected the warnings of superstition, Hawk relied on pragmatism. The mine was merely a challenge of skill, endurance, and courage, and he intended to meet it head-on. Nearby, the remains of a small cabin offered some insight into those who had labored here. The walls were partially collapsed, but charred beams and the remnants of a fireplace suggested men had tried to make it livable during harsh winters. Hawk searched carefully, finding fragments of journals and ledgers, yellowed and brittle with age. One entry stood out: January 12th. The vein runs deep, but the mountain is restless. Strange noises echo at night, and men whisper of shadows moving among the timber. I swear the work eats at a man's mind as surely as hunger does the body. We press on, for silver and survival are one and the same. Hawk's eyes narrowed. The words spoke of hardship, fear, and the relentless demands of the frontier. Yet they lacked the hysteria of rumor. The mountain had claimed lives, yes, but it was the men themselves who had been tested beyond endurance. He pocketed the fragment, recognizing the lesson it carried: caution tempered with resolve, fear acknowledged but not indulged. Exploring further, Hawk noted the collapsed shafts leading deep into the mountainside. Timber supports were rotted, ladders broken, and the dark tunnels exuded an oppressive stillness. The cold, damp air carried the faint metallic scent of ore and rust. Hawk paused, listening to the echo of his own breath, the occasional drip of melting ice, and the subtle shift of snow outside the mine mouth. The place seemed alive with the memories of those who had tried and failed, yet he felt no real fear, only respect for what the mountain demanded. He examined a series of crude markers: stacked stones, initials scratched into timber, and scattered tools partially buried beneath snow. Each told a story of ambition and desperation. One set of initials, carved roughly into a beam, appeared to belong to a man named S. Harper, a name Hawk had seen in Doer's ledger at the trading post. Harper had apparently vanished with two companions during a blizzard in late December, leaving behind their tools and journals. The details were sparse, but Hawk understood the pattern. The mountain took the unprepared, the reckless, and the unlucky. Survival required not only skill but keen observation and a mind capable of adapting to relentless challenges. Hawk set about establishing a temporary camp near the mine, selecting a sheltered spot beneath a rocky ledge. He gathered firewood from nearby pines, using a flint to spark the flame, and cooked a small meal of salted venison. The firelight flickered across the broken timbers and snow, casting shadows that seemed almost alive. He imagined the miners of years past, their lives interrupted by collapse, accident, or the simple brutality of the land. The curse of the mine, he realized, was largely a human one. The mountain magnified every mistake, every moment of impatience, every lapse of judgment. Night descended quickly, and the valley grew colder. The wind whispered through the trees and along the ridges, carrying a sound that might have been the sigh of the mountain or the echo of those who had perished within it. Hawk remained vigilant, maintaining a watch over the mine entrance and surrounding terrain. He reflected on what he had learned from journals, memoirs, and his own experience. A man could endure cold, hunger, and solitude, but hubris and ignorance were often fatal. As the stars emerged, glittering in a clear sky over the peaks, Hawk contemplated his next move. The mine held wealth and reputation, but it also demanded respect, patience, and cunning. The challenge was as much mental as physical. The wilderness and the mountain had long memories, and those who ignored its lessons rarely returned. He planned to explore the tunnels at first light, taking careful note of hazards, supports, and the distribution of ore veins. The valley seemed to hold its breath as Hawk prepared for sleep. The wind had softened, though it still carried the bite of winter, and the distant roar of the stream was a constant reminder of nature's power. He lay beside the fire, rifle within reach, eyes scanning the shadows, ears attuned to every crack of falling ice and rustle of the forest. The cursed mine had a reputation, but Hawk understood the truth. Fortune favored the prepared, the resolute, and the clever. Superstition had its place among men untested by the wilderness, but he was not one of them. By dawn, Hawk would enter the mine, stepping into darkness that had swallowed men before him. Yet he did so willingly, aware of the risks and undeterred by whispers of curses or ghosts. The valley, the abandoned camp, and the mountain itself were silent witnesses to the next chapter of a mountain man's life, one that might elevate him from drifter to legend, if he survived its trials. The wind shifted slightly, carrying a cold promise across the valley. Hawk closed his eyes briefly, taking a final measure of the land, and whispered to himself, "The mountain tests all who enter, but it rewards the vigilant." Then, with careful preparation and the quiet determination that had carried him across countless miles of wilderness, he lay down, knowing that tomorrow would mark the beginning of the mine's true story and his own. At first light, the valley was hushed and brittle with cold. Frost clung to the pines like lace, and a pale mist crept low across the ground, wrapping the mine entrance in a ghostly shroud. John Hawk Hensley stirred from his bedroll, joints stiff from the bitter night. The fire had long since burned to embers. He sat up, brushing snow from his coat, and studied the dark mouth of the mine. The air that drifted from it was unnaturally cold, with a faint metallic tang iron, perhaps silver, and something else he couldn't name. He tightened his gear, slung his rifle, and stepped toward the entrance. Each footfall echoed dully against frozen earth. The remains of the old timbers, once the proud skeleton of the miner's ambitions, groaned faintly in the morning wind. Hawk paused, listening. No sound came from within, only the faint drip of water somewhere in the depths. He lit a small lantern, shielding the flame from the draft, and entered. The passage sloped downward at a steep angle, the walls damp and veined with quartz and dark ore. The smell of rot and mineral decay filled his lungs. He moved carefully, mindful of his footing, marking his path with bits of charcoal against the rock, an old trick learned from trappers who scouted caves along the Missouri. Deeper inside, the air grew thicker, heavier. His lantern threw trembling light across the walls, revealing old tool marks, discarded shovels, and the skeletons of rotted supports. A collapsed section blocked one of the lower tunnels, where frozen mud and timbers pressed together like a sealed tomb. Hawk crouched beside it, inspecting the debris. There were bones there human, though long stripped clean by time. One skull still bore the mark of an old pickaxe wound. He exhaled slowly. "So this is your curse," he muttered. "Not spirits, just men and their greed." The mine's silence pressed around him like a weight. He moved deeper, the sound of dripping water guiding him toward a wider chamber. There, embedded in the rock, he caught a gleam, thin threads of silver running like lightning through stone. His heart quickened. The vein was real. The mine was no myth spun by fearful traders. Men had bled and died for this glinting treasure, and now it lay untouched, waiting for the next fool or fortune-seeker to try his hand. He chipped off a small sample with the back of his hatchet, studying the glimmer under the lantern. It was rich ore, no question, enough to make a man wealthy beyond the modest trades of trapping and guiding. But Hawk knew wealth on the frontier came with a cost. He'd seen men ruin themselves for less a few extra pelts, a handful of coins, a promise of gold that turned to dust. A distant sound broke his reflection, a faint thump from somewhere behind him. Hawk froze, lantern raised. Another thump followed, softer this time, like a footstep muffled by earth. His pulse quickened. He turned, peering down the passage, but saw only darkness. After a moment the sound ceased. Perhaps falling rock, he reasoned, or the mind settling with the thaw. Still, he tightened his grip on his rifle and backed slowly toward the entrance. When he emerged into daylight, the wind had picked up, sweeping snow across the valley in ghostly flurries. He returned to camp and fed his fire, mind restless. He had confirmed what others only whispered. The mine held true metal, and much of it. Yet something about the place gnawed at him, the silence, the unease, the subtle sense that he was not alone. By midday, clouds gathered over the peaks, heavy with snow. Hawk busied himself preparing for the storm. He reinforced his lean-to with pine boughs, cut firewood, and checked his horse's tack. The wilderness was turning, as it often did in spring temperamental, unpredictable, capable of crushing the unprepared. Before dusk, the storm struck. The wind howled through the valley, tearing at trees and scattering snow like white sand. Hawk crouched by the fire, wrapped in his blanket, watching as the flakes thickened to a blizzard. He fed the flames carefully, conserving what wood he could. The storm roared for hours, and in the darkness the mine's shadow seemed to flicker in the firelight like some brooding beast. Sometime past midnight, a sharp crack split the night. Hawk sprang up, rifle in hand. A tree, weakened by the wind, had fallen not 20 paces from his camp. The horse reared and whinnied, nostrils flaring. Hawk calmed the animal, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. Something moved there, just beyond sight. He raised the rifle, finger resting lightly on the trigger. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then a flicker of motion, 2 eyes, reflecting orange in the firelight. Wolves, a small pack, drawn by the scent of smoke and meat. Hawk counted 3, maybe 4 shapes, ghostly against the snow. He fired once, the shot cracking through the storm. One wolf yelped and vanished into the dark, the others scattered, tails low. Hawk reloaded quickly, scanning the tree line until all was still. The echo of the gunshot faded, swallowed by the wind. Morning came slowly, gray and cold. The storm had buried his camp in snow nearly knee-deep. Hawk worked for hours to dig out his supplies and rebuild his fire. The wolves had not returned, though their tracks circled wide around the camp. The land had tested him again and found him worthy for now. As the day cleared, he climbed a nearby ridge to survey the valley. The mine glimmered faintly below, framed by untouched snow and the remains of the old camp. From this height, Hawk spotted movement near the far tree-line figures, faint and distant. 2, maybe 3 men. Trappers, prospectors, or something worse. He couldn't tell. But they were heading toward the valley. He descended quietly, his instincts sharpening. Out here, rivals could mean danger, men killed for less than what that mine might hold. If word had spread of his interest, or if others had followed him from the trading post, then the real trial was just beginning. That evening Hawk set his traps and prepared for defense. He fashioned a simple alarm line using his horse's bell cord and a few tin cups, old tricks learned from nights in Blackfoot country. He banked his fire low, keeping only embers for warmth, and waited. The wilderness was not only a test of body but of patience, nerve, and cunning. As the moon rose over the ridges, pale and silent, Hawk lay awake, listening. He thought of the miners who had once worked this valley, their courage, their greed, and the mountain that swallowed them. He was not afraid, only resolute. The frontier made men of iron, or it broke them to dust. Somewhere out there, beyond the reach of his fire, men were coming. Whether they sought gold or blood, he would soon find out. But one truth remained unshaken in Hawk's mind. The wilderness favored the watchful, and he had spent a lifetime learning to watch. The cursed mine waited, patient as the mountain itself. And Hawk Hensley, drifter, hunter, survivor, was ready for whatever trial came next. The dawn after the storm came clear and biting, the kind that cuts a man's breath short and sharp. The valley glittered under a sheath of ice, and the peaks stood like sentinels of silver and stone. Hawk Hensley rose before sunrise, the fire coals still faintly alive, and listened. No wind, no wolves, no movement, but the soft creak of snow, contracting in the cold. The stillness was unnatural. He poured a bit of boiled coffee into a tin cup, the steam curling up like ghost smoke. As he drank, his eyes never left the ridge where he'd seen the figures the day before. Nothing stirred there now, but in this country, quiet often meant trouble. By mid-morning, he packed light, rifle, hatchet, lantern, and a pouch for samples. He left his horse tied beneath a stand of fur and made his way back toward the mine. The snow crunched beneath his boots, brittle and loud. The air smelled of pine and cold metal. When he reached the entrance, he paused. There were new tracks near the mouth boot prints, half filled with snow, leading in and out. Someone had been here since the storm. Hawk crouched low, tracing one print with a gloved hand. Square heel, iron nail heads, trapper's boots, not moccasins. The stride was short, heavy. Whoever it was had been carrying weight gear or a load, maybe both. He eased into the shadows, rifle in hand, and entered the mine once more. The tunnel seemed darker than before, the air thick with the smell of disturbed dust. He followed the same charcoal marks he'd left, steps measured, breath shallow. The echo of his own boots followed close, whispering off the stone. Deeper in, near the chamber with the silver vein, he found signs of intrusion, fresh pick marks, and a small pile of ore chips scattered near the wall. Someone had been working the rock, perhaps testing the vein for themselves. Hawk's lantern caught a faint glimmer deeper down a side shaft, a tunnel he hadn't explored yet. The opening was narrow, half collapsed, but beyond it he saw the unmistakable glint of something metallic. He hesitated. The shaft looked unstable, the roof bowed and cracked like a frozen river. But something in that glimmer tugged at him. He wedged his rifle between two rocks, drew his hatchet, and began clearing a path. Each strike echoed through the mine, loud and lonely. Dust fell, like snow. After 10 minutes, he squeezed through the opening and raised his lantern high. The chamber beyond was small, no more than 20 feet across, but its walls were alive with silver. Thick veins webbed through the stone like frozen lightning. He stepped closer, marveling. In all his years, he'd never seen ore this rich. Near the far wall, something caught his eye, a shape half buried in rubble. He brushed away loose dirt and stone until a skull emerged, then the curve of a shoulder, then an entire skeleton slumped against the wall, still wrapped in the tatters of a miner's coat. A rusted revolver rested at its side. Beside it, a leather pouch. Hawk crouched and opened the pouch carefully. Inside were several nuggets of near-pure silver, dull with age but heavy in his hand. He whistled low. "You found it, friend," he murmured to the bones, "but looks like it found you too." As he rose, a faint tremor passed through the floor, barely a shiver, but enough to send dust trickling from the ceiling. He froze. Another tremor followed, stronger this time. Somewhere behind him, rock shifted with a dull groan. The shaft wasn't stable. He stuffed the pouch into his coat, grabbed his lantern, and moved quickly toward the exit. He was halfway through the narrow passage when the ceiling cracked with a sound like thunder. A slab of rock crashed down behind him, filling the tunnel with choking dust. He dove forward, landing hard on his shoulder, lantern tumbling out of his grip. The light flickered wildly, then steadied. When the dust cleared, he saw that the way back was half blocked, still passable, but closing fast. Hawk scrambled through, ignoring the pain in his shoulder, and hauled himself into the main tunnel. Another rumble shook the ground, followed by the brittle crack of timber supports snapping. He sprinted toward the entrance, the lantern swinging madly in his hand. He burst out into daylight, just as the tunnel behind him caved in with a roar. A plume of dust and snow blasted out of the mine mouth, rolling across the valley like smoke from a cannon. Hawk stumbled into the open, coughing, his ears ringing. When he turned, the mine was gone, sealed behind tons of collapsed rock. He stood there a long time, breathing hard. The mountain had taken back what was hers. By the time he made it back to camp, the sun was setting in bands of red and gold. His clothes were torn, his hands raw, and the silver pouch weighed heavy against his chest. He fed his fire, melted snow for water, and sat staring into the flames. He thought about the miner, the bones, the pouch, the revolver. Whoever the man had been, he'd died chasing the same promise now glittering in Hawk's pocket. That kind of wealth had a way of cursing men, binding them to the land they sought to master. Hawk wasn't sure if the mine had truly been cursed, or if the curse was simply man's hunger to possess what should be left alone. The night came still and sharp. Somewhere far down the valley, a wolf howled a long, mournful sound that echoed off the ridges. Hawk listened, thoughtful. Just as he was about to turn in, his horse snorted and pawed the snow. Hawk rose slowly, hand to his rifle. From the darkness beyond the firelight came voices low, rough, carried by the wind. He doused the flames with a sweep of his blanket, plunging the camp into darkness. The moon gave little light, but enough to see shapes moving at the edge of the trees. 3, maybe 4 men. One carried a lantern. Hawk crouched behind a fallen log, steadying his rifle. He heard one of them speak too distant to make out the words, but the tone was clear, hard, impatient, searching. They were headed straight toward the mine. He watched them move down the valley, their silhouettes ghostly against the snow. When they reached the mine entrance, they stopped, their lanterns painting the collapsed rock in gold. After a moment, one of them kicked at the rubble, then turned back toward the others. Hawk caught fragments of their voices. Collapsed. Someone's been here. Tracks fresh. Then, silence. One of them lifted his head, scanning the valley. For a heartbeat, Hawk thought the man's eyes found him in the dark. He held still, not breathing. Then the lantern turned away, and the men began to move off toward the ridge, back the way they'd come. Hawk waited until their lights disappeared among the trees before breathing again. He leaned back against the log, exhaustion washing over him. The mine was buried, the silver vein sealed away, but word was out now. Others would come, and next time they might not leave empty-handed. He pulled the leather pouch from his coat, the nuggets glinting faintly in the moonlight. For a long while he stared at them, the weight of both fortune and warning heavy in his palm. Then, slowly, he closed his hand and whispered, "Best to let the mountain keep her secrets." He tossed the pouch into the fire. The silver hissed and spat, sparks rising into the cold night like restless spirits. Hawk sat back, watching until the last ember died. By dawn, he would be gone, just another shadow moving through the high country, leaving behind the cursed valley and the echo of what might have been. By the time Hawk Hensley broke camp and turned his horse eastward, the sky was a hard, pewter gray. The storm had passed, but the cold lingered in the bones of the land. Snow lay deep in the gullies, and the pines wept meltwater that froze again before it reached the ground. Behind him, the valley lay silent, its secrets buried under rock and ice. He rode without hurry, the horse picking its way along the frozen riverbed. Each hoofstep cracked the crusted snow, echoing faintly through the canyon. Hawk's eyes stayed forward, but his thoughts kept circling back to that mine and the men who had followed. The West had a way of feeding on whispers. One man's rumor turned to another man's obsession, and obsession out here got you dead. By noon he reached the high ridge that marked the edge of the old mining basin. From there he could see miles of untouched country rivers twisting like silver threads, forests unbroken, mountains rising blue in the distance. Civilization was weeks away, but he could almost feel its pull-trading posts, whiskey, noise, and the false comfort of walls. He hadn't been to a town in near 3 months. His supplies were thin and his traps long since abandoned. Still, he felt no rush. The wilderness had become his church, his teacher, his judge. Only when the snows grew too deep and the game too lean did he consider riding back to where men lived, shoulder to shoulder, pretending they weren't afraid of the dark. By late afternoon, he descended into a narrow pass lined with spruce and alder. The wind funneled through it like a voice moaning low. He caught faint signs of passage hoofprints, a bit of tobacco ash, and a strip of torn cloth snagged on a branch. The men from the valley had come this way too, heading east. He dismounted, crouched, and studied the tracks. 3 riders, maybe 4, all heavy laden. They were pushing hard hoof cuts, deep and sloppy, likely desperate to reach the nearest post before word of the mine spread wider. Hawk smiled grimly. "You boys better ride fast," he muttered, "for the mountain calls you back." As darkness closed in, he made camp beside a frozen creek. He built a small fire, just enough for coffee and warmth, and roasted a strip of venison jerky. The flames licked the air, fragile and bright, against the immensity of night. Coyotes yipped somewhere down the ridge, answered by another pack farther off. Hawk listened with a faint, knowing smile. When sleep came, it came hard and shallow. He dreamed of tunnels that whispered, of silver veins that pulsed like living things beneath the earth. When he woke, dawn was breaking pink over the ridges, and his horse stood restless, ears twitching. By mid-morning he reached the edge of the timberline and saw smoke on the horizon, a thin, steady plume. A settlement. The nearest trading post lay another day's ride beyond, but this was something else. A camp, maybe. Or trouble. He rode closer, staying to the trees. Soon the shapes of 3 tents came into view beside a half-frozen pond. 2 horses grazed nearby, and a third stood saddled and restless. Hawk recognized the men before they saw him, the same silhouettes he'd watched near the mine. He dismounted, tied his horse, and moved forward through the brush. The men were arguing. Their words carried on the wind, harsh and bitter. "I told you the mine's buried for good," one snapped. "Ain't no use digging through half a mountain." "The ore's there," another shot back. "I seen what was left in the rocks, enough silver to buy a whole town. Somebody was in there before us, took what he could and sealed it up. You think it's coincidence we found tracks?" A third man spat into the snow. "Whoever it was, he's long gone. Dead maybe, let it be." Hawk stepped into the open, rifle in the crook of his arm. "You boys best take his advice." The men spun around, hands darting to their belts. For a long second, no one spoke. Then one of them, a tall, wiry fellow with a scar along his jaw, squinted hard. "Well, I'll be damned. Hensley, ain't it?" "Used to be," Hawk said evenly. "Now I'm just passing through." The scarred man grinned without warmth. "We seen your tracks, old-timer. You were up near that cursed hole before the slide. Figure you found something worth sealing off." "Only found bones and bad luck," Hawk said. "That valley's got more ghosts than silver. Best steer clear." The man's grin widened. "Funny thing about luck. Some folks make their own." He nodded to the others. "Search him." Hawk didn't move. His voice dropped low, quiet as a drawn blade. "You reach for me, son, and you'll find out what kind of luck you really got." The standoff held, the air tight as wire. Then one of the younger men shifted his hand toward his pistol. Hawk moved faster, rifle up, hammer back, sight steady. "Don't," he said softly. The young man froze, eyes wide. For a long, brittle moment, no one breathed. Then the scarred man laughed once, sharp and dry. "Easy, old hound, we don't want no fight. Not in this cold." He raised his hands, palms out. "We'll leave it be. Ain't worth dying for." "Good," Hawk said. "Then ride, and don't look back." They packed quick, saddling their horses with nervous hands. Within minutes they were gone, riding east into the white dawn. Hawk watched them go until they vanished among the trees, then let out a slow breath. His heart still beat steady. He'd seen enough killing for 2 lifetimes.